Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, June 18th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the issue of abortion and the Republican Party's inability to message on this issue correctly going into a very crucial and key election year such as this one. Now, the Republican Party, since the Dobbs decision, has yet to find a way to talk about the issue of abortion in a way that is conducive for them to win more voters over, from the independent column, from more left-leaning columns, from generally speaking, a portion of the electorate that they otherwise might be able to win over if it wasn't for this issue. I'm often reminded of the 2022 midterm elections when I think about these upcoming 2024 elections, because these elections were very different than what the polls had predicted, and a lot of it had to do with the issue of abortion. When the Supreme Court ruled that Roe v. Wade, a 49-year landmark case, had to be overturned for the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, it returned abortion rights to the states. It allowed states to enact total and complete abortion bans in battleground states, in red states, and in some cases, even in more Democratic-leaning states that had Republican advantages in the governorship, in the legislature, that all around made it very difficult for women, in many instances, to get an abortion as they had been able to for 49 years prior. And so voter turnout on the Republican side had maintained itself from what we had seen in previous midterm elections, but on the Democratic side, we saw it skyrocket, especially amongst women and minority voters in particularly disadvantaged regions of the country that turned out to vote for Democrats in the midterm elections. They used the issue of abortion in conjunction with many other things that they cared about, things like the economy, the southern border, the, healthcare, whatever it might be. There were so many different things that people kept in mind when they were looking at the 2022 midterm elections, but abortion was a driving factor, especially when it came down to governor elections. Now, the Senate elections were one thing. Democrats did quite well there. They expanded their majority and did substantially better than what many people were expecting, including myself. On the governor's side, though, this is where Democrats really shined through. They did a better performance than they had in 2018, which was a very strong wave year for the Democratic Party, and it showed exactly what the power was when you message on abortion correctly for Democrats, and Republicans just simply can't get their acts together. A very notable example is the state of Arizona, where Governor Katie Hobbs, then the Secretary of State, was running against Kari Lake, the Republican nominee for governor, and they had two very different stances on the issue of abortion. On one end, Katie Hobbs was very pro-choice, very adamant that she would not implement an abortion ban, uphold the abortion ban, whatever it might be. Kari Lake, on the other hand, had very much advertised that she was pro-life, in some instances without exceptions, and she was painted as an extremist. Well, guess what? The polls said Kari Lake would win by 3.5%. Joe Biden only won the state by 0.2 in 2020. And when the national numbers shift, the generic ballot went from being what Democrats were up by 7 in polls on Election Day in 2020, ended up winning by roughly 5, to now Republicans being ahead by 3 points, whether it was a 10-point swing in the polls or an 8-point swing in actuality, because that's what happened. Republicans ended up winning by 3 points nationwide. Arizona shifted to the left. And it wasn't just here. The issue of abortion was prevalent in a number of battleground states, and also competitive states, like Kansas, which had an abortion referendum. A Trump plus 15 state rejected a pro-life initiative there and said that abortion was going to remain legal in the state of Kansas by a 20-point margin. In the state of Maine, Paul LePage, who served as governor in this state, some Republicans were worried, Democrats were worried, rather, that Janet Mills might end up losing in a wave year. She won by 13. In Michigan, an abortion referendum on the ballot carried Gretchen Whitmer to an 11-point victory. Why? Tudor Dixon was pro-life with no exceptions. So many different instances here where a pro-life stance made you ultimately lose the election in ways that were of really epic proportions for the Democratic Party. You have Michigan, you have Kansas, you even have a state like Wisconsin, where Democrats believed that they were going to lose here, that Tim Michels was going to be the next governor, but Tony Evers very much was on the side that the voters chose when it came down to abortion, and he ended up winning. And same thing in Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro cleared the opposition, a 15-point margin to victory there for the Democratic Party. And so why am I giving you all this context for 2022 in relation to 2024? Well, I think we're starting to get to a point where abortion is going to matter more and more now. In just 6 days, it will be the 2-year anniversary of the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, the decision that overturned abortion as a right for women across this country, full stop. And so when that is something that Democrats, from that day onward through the election, will be messaging on correctly, they are going to hit portions of this country. They are going to hit minority groups that already are, in a way, at a disadvantage for a variety of different reasons, combined with the fact that now there is an active threat in their eyes. This is the way it's going to be positioned. An active threat from the Republican Party to enact a national abortion ban, statewide abortion bans, go ahead and ban contraceptives, IVF, whatever it might be. Republicans are looking at this issue and they are going to try to do something with it. And that's the way Democrats are going to paint this. That Project 2025 is going to get rid of contraception. That Project 2025 is going to make abortion illegal. And this is the problem here for Donald Trump and the GOP. There is no consistency. On one end, Donald Trump spoke to an abortion group that calls, a Christian advocacy group that calls abortion child sacrifice. It's an anti-abortion group, rather. This is a group that calls abortion child sacrifice. Donald Trump goes to them and just says, you know what? He doesn't mention abortion. He says that we need to protect innocent life, and he does the same thing when it comes down to many different places. I mean, he just simply tries to message on it on one end to not be extreme. And then on the other end, goes ahead to conservative media and on the stages there when he's speaking at his rallies, touting that he got rid of Roe versus Wade, that he is the guy who got rid of it. I mean, these are the simplest lifts for the Democratic Party. Why? Because Donald Trump himself is telling you who he is on the issue of abortion. He has been adamant since he ran for president as a Republican that he is pro-life. While he may not be, in actuality, I don't know what his personal political stance on this. He's switched 13 times in the past 25 years. But recently, he's been pro-life, with minimal exceptions, but largely pro-life, but just can't seem to get that correct. It also comes into a fact that Republicans just simply are not aligned with Donald Trump on the issue of abortion. The majority of Republicans are far more conservative on the issue of abortion than Donald Trump is. When he won't even mention it to an anti-abortion group, to a Christian advocacy group, that means he's trying to make this more center, trying to peel away from that brand that Republicans have given themselves as the, pro-life to no extreme, to any extreme. And that is what Republicans have self-identified as for the past 50 years. That is how they have inspired their base to turn out in off years. That is how they've inspired voters who, looked at abortion as single issue votes for some people. Some people are very much single issue voters on the issue of abortion. Same thing for Democrats. Vote for Democrats because of abortion. Vote for Republicans because of abortion. And Donald Trump was able to tap into that in 2016. Why? Because Roe versus Wade was in place. Every Democratic talking point that the Supreme Court would overturn Roe versus Wade was mute. Why? Because Roe versus Wade hadn't been challenged for the first time in 2022. It had been challenged relentlessly. And Supreme Court justices for 50 years were unable to overturn it because the ideological Supreme Court, the conservative Supreme Court that we have right now, was not as conservative in years past. More ideologically diverse, more left-leaning, more, in some cases, right-leaning on some issues, but not on the issue of abortion. It had been a tried and tested Supreme Court case that had not been overturned until Donald Trump got his justices in. And so the messaging on this just simply isn't strong enough. It's not put together. The Republican Party doesn't know what they're doing because many of them are blocking IVF in a vote that Democrats very much use to their advantage to say, look at the Republicans and look at them when they tell you who they are. Republicans signed on to, 49 of them, signed on in the Senate to a letter that says we support IVF nationwide. Then vote for it. Because guess what? There is no actual action behind a letter like that. And as much as they think that might appease some members of the left or independent, it doesn't. Because voters care about how you actually vote with the power they are giving you in Congress. And while sure, the Roger Wicker from the state of Mississippi might not care, but somebody, for instance, like Ron Johnson in Wisconsin should. Or somebody like Susan Collins in Maine should. And so she ended up voting for it because political instincts are a little bit stronger with some than others. But I do think when you're looking at IVF, when you're looking at messaging on abortion, nothing is put together, and that is the ultimate pitfall of the Republican Party. I also look at Arizona, when the Republican Party there had this abortion law from the Civil War era. I mean, before Arizona was even a state. That was a complete and total ban on abortion in Arizona. It meant no exceptions for rape, incest, the life of the mother, none of that. Nothing was going to be considered for an exception on this issue. And so Arizona Republicans, with their slim majority, you're talking as slim as Democrats have in the Senate and as slim as they had in the House, or Republicans have in the House right now, one seat, roughly, right? The equivalent of that in the House and the Senate. Republicans, for a while, refused to repeal this abortion ban. And that's because their constituents who are far more conservative than the rest of the country on issues like abortion. Conservatives came to the Arizona state capitol. They prayed with legislators. They lobbied legislators and said, if you vote to repeal this abortion ban, we will primary you. And so then those legislators who are thinking very much politically, worried about losing their state Senate election, worried about losing their state House election, come into this and say, we are going to vote the way my constituents want. And how might that be? Anti-abortion, not repealing the ban. And then when eventually Donald Trump levied in and said, Arizona, y'all need to change this. Why? Because it looked bad for the Republican Party. It was a draconian law. No one could justify that a law that was written into place before Arizona was a state should be enacted in the state of Arizona. That is just not the way that it works unless you're talking about a constitutional provision, unless you're talking about a pact amongst states. That's a very different thing than a law that was written into place with not even a consideration that there might be procedures related to a woman's life at risk. Right? People didn't treat these things as fact. They didn't know. They didn't have the technology. I'm getting on a different point here. My takeaway from this is that eventually the Republicans who did repeal the abortion ban faced blowback from members of their party and may eventually be challenged in primaries later down the line and may eventually lose those seats for simply repealing an abortion ban. And so when you see articles like these, and you see Donald Trump messaging on things very differently than you see Senate leaders on the GOP side, House leaders on the GOP side, nothing is consistent. And it makes the party look very, very much like a failure on this issue. And when I think about the 2024 election, I am reminded too, where are there going to be abortion referendums in this election? Well, states like Nevada, states like Arizona, states like Colorado, potentially even Pennsylvania. States that have very competitive presidential, Senate, whatever it might be, House, right? Competitive races that Democrats are going to jump onto this with that abortion referendum on the ballot and say, if you are voting, I mean, Florida has one too, so might as well throw that in there too. If you are voting for abortion, for pro-choice, whatever it might be, yes or no, depending on the question, vote for Democrats down ballot. Because while it may not seem like it's the easiest connection to be made, Republicans will have to pick a side. Donald Trump will have to pick a side or get on stage with someone who publicly is picking a side, using that platform to say, on issue 1 in Ohio, vote yes. Well, no. And the voters said, well, no. And then you ended up seeing that those people ended up fading off. Remember Frank LaRose going to ride the abortion referendum to victory in the Senate race, lost his primary, lost the abortion referendum, is so politically irrelevant that he tries to take Joe Biden off the ballot because that's the only way he can get his name in headlines anymore. That's what this does to people. That's the damage that abortion does to the GOP. In the fact that voters here, red state, blue state, purple state, are pro-choice. And if any of them even draw the association, and I promise you, Democrats have already started doing it, draw associations that being pro-choice is a Democratic vote, being pro-IVF is a Democratic vote. Can't even believe we're arguing on this, genuinely speaking, from a personal standpoint. I do not know from any political standpoint why at all this is in contention. Contraception is potentially in conversation here. Democrats are winning over the issue of women's rights and abortion very much so, the same way they did in 2022. The real question will be, for President Biden, is that enough to carry him over the finish line? When people are worried about what is happening in the Middle East, when people are thinking about what's getting onto their dinner table, is this going to be a top issue in a way that it was in 2022? And it's not to say that voters, again, I mentioned this very early on in the video, they absolutely voted on the economy and immigration and whatever it might be. I mean, on the top issues at the time. They also voted on abortion as well. When grouped into there, you have voters who are on the fence, voters who may begrudgingly be moving left and right. And with that guilty verdict we talked about yesterday, there are very much voters out there that could say it's a double whammy. 2 years post-Dobbs, Republicans tried to institute a national abortion ban. Senator Lindsey Graham put forth a bill of that roughly a year ago. Democrats know that this is a way to message. And they know that it plays right into people's fears because they've already seen their rights stripped away on the statewide level. Now it's going to be a question about how Democrats nationalize this. But the Republican Party just simply can't get their act together on this. They don't know what they're doing when it comes down to IVF. They don't know what they're doing when it comes down to discussing abortion. They don't know what they're doing when it comes down to retribution on candidates and elected officials who are pro-choice, or it might not even be pro-choice, but are repealing a draconian law in a state like Arizona, a super competitive state. I look at this and I see multiple failures on the part of the GOP, multiple instances where they simply just can't get a universal line here because they feel so passionately about this. Democrats, on the other hand, are pretty clear-cut. We're pro-choice. We're pro-choice for women to have an abortion should they want one. That's it. Republicans, it's far more complicated and far, far, far more unpopular amongst the American public, and that will be a pitfall for the Trump campaign, for Republicans nationwide, and be a big reason, if Donald Trump is to lose, that he also loses the election. You have conviction, you have Dobbs, you have so many different things that could be playing a major role in this election. And I think Democrats know that campaigning on IVF, campaigning on contraception, campaigning against Project 2025, and of course, campaigning for abortion is an effective way to win an election because they did it once. Maybe they can do it again. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.